everyone. I'll get stuck in because I know you've got a tight schedule. The 2020 wave of the BLM movement normalised conversations about race. After the murder of George Floyd, Black people had a collective racial trauma response, one that transcended continents and led to the largest global civil rights movement in history. BLM achieved many positive changes, such as legislative changes in Wales to teach all children Black history. But a key change was the normalisation of conversations around race. And there's a lot of power in that. From conversations come actions, and from actions comes change. And that's what the Cheshire and Merseyside Social Work Teaching Partnership is hoping to do with the launch of this anti-racist toolkit. Achieve societal changes by combating racism head-on. This toolkit provides an opportunity for social work staff to express their feelings on racism, to talk, to be heard, and most importantly, to generate solutions. Now, I'm not here to tell you that this is going to be an easy process. Talking is hard, active listening even more so. Conversations about race don't always make people feel comfortable, and that's good. Racism kills. It destroys generations of lives and has done for hundreds of years. And it's time we got comfortable feeling uncomfortable if we're to achieve lasting generational change. So today I'm going to talk to you about BLM, or Black Lives Matter. I'm going to talk about my own experiences of racism and why this toolkit is important to me. And I'm also going to outline why this toolkit matters to those who you work with and support. So a little bit about me. For those who don't know me, I'm Chantelle Lunt. I'm quite well known for this part up here. And if anyone's wondering, how does a police officer end up leading a civil rights organisation? Spoiler, it's racism. But I want to start over here on this picture here, because one of the lesser known things about me is that I grew up in the care system. I spent most of my childhood in the care system, going into care when I was 2 years old. And when I was born, I was raised in Liverpool 8 in Toxteth on Windsor Street, and Liverpool 8 is a wonderfully diverse area. And I lived with my Black family, with my 2 brothers and my mum. And when I was taken into care, I was removed from my brothers. They were put into a separate home to me. They were together. I was separated. But also I was removed from the area. So while they remained in the area, I went to an area called Halewood. And if anyone knows Halewood, you'll know that it's far less diverse than L8. The actual demographic makeup is 1% of the population, and Halewood is Black or global majority. So at one time, we were literally the only Black people in the village, because Halewood is a village. And that can be hard, and it's something we really need to think about, because when children are taken into care, they lose a lot. But when Black children are taken into care, they lose a lot of the cultural and racial identity. So within our cultures, a lot of our identities are kept, things around music, things around culture, things around food, how to look after our skin, how to look after our hair. That generational knowledge about our family stories and our history as a community is kept within the community. It's not always captured in books. It's not always something that you can go and find in a library or on TV, and you very much have to be near your community or with your family to have that knowledge. So when children from Black and global majority backgrounds are taken into care, quite often that knowledge is taken, despite many efforts. And for me, I was extremely lucky, because I was placed with a Black carer. This is my carer, my mum, Joan Edison, and I was with her. I was lucky because I was with her for 14 years, so I was with her until I was 16, and she remains in my life until she passed away a few years ago. But I was also lucky because I had a Black social worker too. So although I'd lost a lot, and I experienced a lot of racism in Halewood, a lot of overt, violent racism in Halewood, I had this protective bubble of being able to go home to someone who looked like me, who knew those experiences, who retained a lot of my racial identity within my home bubble. And even my first social worker, I'll always remember Rowena. She was someone who would go to great lengths when we went out together to make sure that I was in touch with my culture and with my community. So we spent a lot of time in LA whenever she took me out, and that for me was really important. But I recognise my privilege even within the care system. because of the unique upbringing I had and the fact that I had a stable care placement for most of my childhood, and had an incredible influence in my mum, who just, you know, even when I struggled, set me back on the path to do the right thing. I'm one of only around 6% of care experienced people who do go on to higher education. So it was something that I was really keen to explore in my research and also in my activism. So I set up this project down here, which is called Jones New Pathways Project, which is all about considering how to support care experienced people around health, around wellness, around education, around leaving the care system, and most importantly, community building. And this is all care experienced children. But let's get to this part up here. BLM, we're at a 2-year reflection point, and it really is the 2 years that changed my life. So when I was in the police force, although I look shockingly young on this picture, I'm like nearly in my 30s on this picture. I joined the police force after 12 years in the council. I worked for Liverpool Social Care and Children's Centres as a family support worker for around 12 years. And after, like, I went straight into children's centres after moving out to Hale Woods. I thought racism had ended in this 12 years because I was in a place that was like, I was very privileged. Again, I was in this bubble. I worked with an incredible team who saw me for who I was as an individual. They helped me to thrive within the organisation. They encouraged me to educate myself, get promotions. And it was very much, it wasn't, I was seen as a black person and that was it. I was seen as Chantelle, and that helped me to thrive, and it helped me to think that I could go on and achieve everything. So I joined the police, and quite quickly that bubble burst, and I realised that racism was alive and well, and I saw every kind of racism. As an officer, it was directed at me towards other officers, and I saw it directed at my community by officers. And when I put my hands up and said that this isn't okay, when I spoke out about it, you know, that race card that they say we all had, when I used my race card and tried to stop it from happening, what happens to many black people happened to me. I was ostracised, I was gaslit, I was told we're not going to talk about this today, and I was made to feel that calling out racism was not something that I should have done. But despite this, despite raising awareness of this, despite calling it out, I did remain in the organisation for some time. But again, when I didn't see changes and when I didn't see people responding to what I had raised, I did what a lot of black people will do in organisations that aren't serving them. I voted with my feet and I left. So I left the organisation, went to university, and around 2 years into my degree, George Floyd happens, and we all know what happened with George Floyd. I don't need to tell you, but for me, that was the catalyst that everything that I'd seen within the police force, everything I'd seen at a societal level, had to stop. It could not go on any longer. So I set up Merseyside BLM Alliance. It's one of the most proactive BLMs in the UK. And from that, we set up Merseyside Alliance for Racial Equality, which is a community interest company, which does a lot of educational and proactive work in the community to try and dismantle racism. And at this 2-year point, you know, there were a lot of people who said that BLM was just a moment. There were a lot of people who said it wasn't going to go anywhere. But at this 2-year mark, it is uplifting and inspiring to see organisations and groups such as Cheshire and Merseyside Social Work Teaching Partnership continuing to hold space for this conversation, continuing to say, we're not going to move until things change, until we dismantle racism. And it's important because the UK has not always wanted to hold conversations such as this. So let's talk about a little bit of history of BLM in the UK. So BLM didn't start in 2020. No civil rights movement started in 2020. Civil rights movement, black resistance has been happening since we were taken off ships and brought to Europe. People have been resisting their oppression. In the UK, the most prominent civil rights movement, arguably before BLM, was the 1970s civil rights movement, when we had the British Black Panthers. But quite often, when we talk about race and conversations about racism, civil rights movements, the frames around American experiences of race. So BLM happened because this young man up here on the left was murdered by vigilantes, and in 2013 they got off. They were acquitted of all charges. And Alicia Garza, who was one of the founders of BLM, put this statement out. She put it out on Facebook, so you can tell it was years ago. She said, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." It was an affirmation. It was an act of resistance. It was an act to uplift and heal a broken community, to say it might feel when we look out there, when we look at the police, when we look at the criminal justice system, that we are worth nothing, but our lives matter. It wasn't saying other lives don't matter. It wasn't saying that other people don't experience discrimination, but it was saying that Black lives matter too, because it didn't feel like they did. And, you know, We'd like to say that we achieved change that year, but we all know how the story ends. More people continued to die. Every one of these people, but Trayvon Martin, died as a result of police contacts. Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor. But the significant difference is these people on the left all died in America. And people will often tell you that this is only an American problem. It's only a problem with American police forces. Every one of these people on the right, Leon Briggs, MZ Mohammed, Kevin Clark, they all died in the UK. All of these black men died while they were having a mental health crisis. All of these black men died while being restrained by the police. So the police in the UK might not have the same kit as those in America. They might not have as many guns, but they are just as effective as enacting harm against black bodies. And it's important to know that we are not exempt here in the UK. So when we think about the experiences of people in the UK and how we talk about race and the conversations that happened since BLM in 2020, a key term that kind of came to the fore, one that we're probably all aware with working in social care, is institutional racism. Macpherson coined it in 1999 after the Stephen Lawrence report, but institutional racism, something that we as activists were keen for people to understand is, yes, the police are the most visible, violent enactors of institutional racism and systemic racism, but it is not something that is exclusive to police forces. It is a foundation of society in Western society, and it exists in nearly every organisation within Western society, in our educational institutions, within our health institutions, within social care, within youth work, within the community. It is everywhere. And in order to combat it, we need to not turn the other way and act like our organisation is exempt, but to actively seek it out, to actively be anti-racist in our endeavours. So BLM wasn't the only thing that happened in 2020, and it wasn't the only thing that made us aware of racial disparities. And you can see this chart on your screen now. I did not need this chart to know that black people were dying at a disproportionate rate. I could see it on the television. I could see it and I was like, what is happening here? Like, COVID seems to be disproportionately impacting black and brown people. And then the report came, and then the chart came, which showed the government, those health leaders predicted that black people would die at the same rate as white people during the coronavirus pandemic, which is at 1 times the national average rate of death, this line here. What actually happened was that some parts of the black community died at almost 3 times the national average rate of death. How can that happen in a society where we all have equal access to the NHS? How can that happen where we're told we know our bodies are the same, we know our biology is the same? How can this happen? And this is what we talk about when we say systemic and institutional racism. This is housing inequalities that put many black people right by motorways and exposed to disproportionate levels of pollution. This is educational inequalities. This is inequalities in access to healthcare. This is all of those things. This is black workers being put on the front line in spite of all the evidence that showed that they were at a higher risk of dying from COVID. They were not put on any vulnerability lists or protected. They continued to put black and brown workers out there on the front line. And this is the result of that. The result of institutional and structural racism is death, disproportionate death. Again, a year later, we got the data that showed that black women were 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. How can this happen? We have equal access to an NHS. Many of our women's hospitals are rooted in diverse communities, but they weren't the only statistics that came out. We learned that black people were 9 times more likely to be stop and searched. There was a 35% increase in Section 60 stop and searches against black communities, with just 4% leading to arrests. That's not profiling. I don't know what is. Black people are more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. Unison data showed that black people were more likely to be overqualified than their white counterparts who were given promotions. Black women were 2 times more likely than white women to be community leaders, were ambitious, driven, and open to progression within the workplace. Yet we are consistently overlooked and undervalued. Black women are massively underrepresented in senior leadership roles in the workplace. And in the police force, as I've alluded to, black female women are the most likely demographic to resign voluntarily than any other demographic within the police force. Now let's look at social work. So that headline there shows that for social work England, only 2% of their workforce were Black and global majority staff, compared with 12% of children's social workers and 15% of adult social workers. So social work in England, obviously a specialist regulator focused on enabling positive changes, and this speaks to the need to have a diverse, representative workforce at every level. We need Black and global majority people steering the changes that we are crying out for in society. So social work in England made a commitment to change that, and it's great to see that that happens, and that is currently happening. To give you some context, the racial demographic in this country is 14%, so 14% of the country is Black and global majority people. So with the 12% for children social work and the 15% for adults, we're a little bit closer, but 2% is nowhere near representative. Over a quarter of social workers across England experienced racism from people they worked with over a 12-month period. That was a survey of almost 2,000 practitioners. The same survey found that 31% of Black social workers said they'd experienced racism from colleagues or managers at least 5 times in the previous 12 months, 28% for Asian social workers. And 1 in 5 respondents reported having increased anxiety and 13% worse mental health as a result of experiencing racism, while 1 in 10 had considered leaving their jobs and 8% left the profession altogether. That's a study by What Works for Social Care. And again, if anyone's feeling any discomfort at this moment, that's fine. It's okay to feel uncomfortable, but the question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's hopefully the solutions that we're going to be building on today. So let's talk about the experiences of Black and global majority adults in care homes. Now, in care homes, Black and global majority people actually make up a really small proportion of the population, and this is because of cultural norms within our community. So only 3% of the adult care home population is from Black and global majority communities, and that's because within our communities, just because of the way it is culturally, we tend to look after our own home. So we have a lot of multi-generations living in households together. When people become elderly or frail, we either tend to continue to look after them in the households, or relatives will move back in, or because of where we sit geographically, we still stay close to each other. We'll tend to just look after our elderly within the community. With all that taken into account, you'd be forgiven for thinking the Black and global majority people were then less likely to die within care homes because there were less of us there. Not the case again. Around 58% of Black and global majority residents in care homes died during COVID, compared to around 47% of white residents. And again, this speaks to this thread of the need for cultural insight, because when people contacted family members, they felt that a fundamental aspect was the fact that those who died felt socially isolated. They'd never been so isolated in their lives. They'd gone from having family around them constantly to being completely cut off, and they felt that that was a significant factor in the deaths of their family members. Let's talk about the experiences of children in the care system. As I said, I did a bit of research around this for my undergrad, and a term that really struck me was something that I knew that I'd experienced when I was in care, but it was good to have a name for it. It was careism, which is defined the specific discrimination which young people in care are subjected to. And that's things like the mad or bad labels used around children in the care system, public and media attitudes that regard care experienced young people as untrustworthy, inconsistent, hardened by the system, all of those things. I mean, I see some shocking media representations of care experienced young people, but a term that's come about more recently as a result of the Child Q report is this term here, adultification. And this is all around Black children being treated as mini adults. They're denied child status. They're often treated by authorities, schools, the police as adults, and the vulnerabilities, any, lack of knowledge, it's not taken into consideration when responding to their needs. And these terms to me are strikingly similar when we think about how Black children are treated and when we think about how care experienced children is treated. The terms careism and adultification are strikingly similar, but we do need to think about intersectionality. So intersectionality is obviously the intersection of experiences of discrimination, but it can also be the intersection of experiences of advantage because of your identity demographics. For instance, a white, cis, gender male might experience advantages over a Black gay, female in the workplace because of those intersections. So that intersectionality is the same within the care system. So when we look at Black care experienced children, they're not just care experienced children, they're Black as well. And those intersections of discrimination still exist. So there are unique experiences that Black children within the care system might go through. And that's evident in the fact that 25% of the youth justice prison population are care experienced people, but equally 25% of the youth justice prison population are people of Black and global majority backgrounds, and 25% of the care population are Black and global majority backgrounds. So there's this over-representation across the board, and when we consider the experiences of people within the care system, race should be one of the key things considered. And again, when I done my research, it wasn't on the experiences of Black people within the care system. My research was actually on the care to prison pipeline. And I was interviewing a lot of Black respondents because they were the people that I knew. And what struck me was the amount of people who spoke about what it was like being a Black child in care. And that's where I kind of realised that I'd had a very different experience because I grew up with a Black carer and I had a Black social worker. And so I feel like my experience of race was a lot different to theirs. And it really made me aware of the power of having a diverse workforce, a social worker level, but also a diverse workforce with our carers too. So here are some of the things they said. There needs to be more of an understanding around how to care for Black people and an understanding of our culture. You know, it's this kind of cultural misunderstanding that leads us to be more likely to get involved in crime, a lack of self-esteem. For me, it's where they put Black children with white families who have no knowledge of their culture or their hair. Hair and skin was just something that came up constantly. And these respondents were aged 18 to 60, and like, you know, different generations who've been through the care system, and just constant references to the feeling that the hair and the skin just wasn't being looked after, and that being a significant factor in how they perceive their experiences in care. This one was quite interesting. There was a Black person going into a white foster home. This, for me, my very first foster home, I said, what on earth am I doing here? Because I'd never had a white person look after me before. That was the only reason. In fact, that lady gave me the best kind of love. I'd never seen such a beautiful love. It was really nice, a really caring relationship. And this, for me, is significant because when we talk about the work that needs to be done, it's not just Black and global majority people who can do the work. And look at what this woman did. With respect to this child's culture and identity, he went on to talk about how she would make an effort to cook the meals that he's had at home. She would make an effort to take him to spaces where he'd see people who look like him and have that connection with his community. And this was a white person. And again, we're not saying that this work can only be done by Black people. In fact, it can't be done by Black people. We didn't create these systems and we didn't create these oppressions. It involves everybody. But I just thought this quote was quite beautiful because it shows the power of a well-informed, knowledgeable, culturally aware white person making all the difference in the life of a Black child who was within the care system and separated from kind of his cultural identity. She ensured that he wasn't. But let's talk about why we need a diverse workforce and that kind of, you know, that cultural insight that people always reference, that cultural knowledge. And it's actually a TikTok video. I talk about this all the time. I deliver a lot of training. I do a lot of work within organisations and I talk about that cultural insight. And usually it takes me longer than 2 minutes, but thanks to my son forcing me to get involved in TikTok, it can take me around 2 minutes to explain this. So my son, first, I'll take 2 minutes to explain why I'm on TikTok as an almost middle-aged person. My son, I thought TikTok was probably the technological hill that I was going to die on. I was like, you know, I'm going to have to let some tech pass me by. TikTok's full of people dancing. I can't dance. I'm going to leave that one. And my teenage son was like, no, Mum, there's loads of educational videos on there. You'll love this. So I gave it a try and I realised actually he's right. It's really good. When you've got a break, go on there. You can find out about some of the things you're interested in. So a video I saw recently was a nurse talking about why cultural knowledge was important, and she was the Black nurse, and she said she's on shift, and one of the other nurses who was a white nurse came up to her and she said, oh, I'm going to have to put a mental health referral in for the patients up in that room. And she said she hadn't seen the patient, but she said, oh, why? And she said the patient, every time I walk in, she's hitting herself on the head. She just won't stop hitting herself on the head. And the Black nurse looked at her and she said, is the woman Black at all? And she said, yeah, how do you know that? And she said, and when you say hitting herself, is she patting her hair like this? And she said, yeah, have you been in there? And she said, no, I've not been in there. But within our culture, we wear weave and we have braids like mine in our hair. And so we don't mess up the styles. We're taught not to, if our hair gets itchy, not to itch it, but just to pat our hair like this. And as you can see, Beyonce did a whole song about it, pat your weave, she's doing a little pat there. She said she's not, you know, she's not hitting herself on the head if she's doing that. She's got an itchy head, like, you know, she had more, yeah, it turns out she just had an itchy head and that's how she was patting her head. So due to that cultural insight, this woman was not referred to mental health services, and that's the kind of cultural insight within workforces that we're talking about. If you're not part of that culture or group or demographic, it's less likely that you would have that kind of knowledge.
Just giving you a time check, Chantelle, sorry.
So what, 5 minutes?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I'm cool. I mean, my last 5 minutes were good. So we're at a unique junction in history, one where generations of harm could be undone, but we need the right tools for the job. I'm welcoming the launch of this anti-racist toolkit. And to be honest, in my head, I'm imagining us using spanners and screwdrivers to dismantle systemic and institutional racism piece by piece. To be anti-racist is a verb, and that involves action. So we need to be ready not just to talk and listen, but to act. To make this happen, we have to shift our mindset. It's okay to be uncomfortable and we might say the wrong thing, but what matters is that we're striving forward for a better tomorrow and intentionally acting to achieve racial equality. We're not going to push this onto the next generation. Every one of us has a role to play in combating racism, and every one of us can be the change that we so desperately need. Thank you.